This is Real Talk, the Customer Insights Show with Jen Vogel, a top-rated live stream and podcast in the market research and insights industry. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen on all major podcast channels. Join Jen and her guests for a weekly discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Real Talk is presented to you by Voxpopme, the leader in video research and ranked number 1 in qualitative research by Grit 2 years running. Here's today's conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, and everyone who wants to understand their customers better. I'm your host, Jen Vogel. Market research technology can help us improve workflows, increase the speed of projects, and even help us understand insights at scale. One way to do that is by using natural language processing. But what is it? How does it work? And what do we need to be aware of? To discuss the topic, Voxpopme founder and CTO Andy Barraclough returns to Real Talk. Welcome back.
Hey, Jen. Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
You on. Yeah, thanks for joining. You know, I was thinking with this topic that I need to do a bunch of research so I know what I'm talking about when I ask you questions about natural language processing, but I didn't do any of that. I figure maybe a beginner's mind is a better spot to be in for today.
Well, that's all good. Yeah, no, I think we'll get through that. I was expecting you to have done a ton of podcast research, 3 or 4 books done.
Yeah, well, I figured
to get you onto the team to do the next set of development, I suppose.
That's exactly what I'm trying to avoid. So yeah. Awesome. Well, to get us started on the topic, can you just give us a definition of what natural language processing is?
Yes, all good. So yeah, natural language processing. So I guess thinking about it, it's think about how we're communicating right now, and we're trying to understand each other as we're having our conversation, discussing what we are discussing. And natural language processing is essentially how we enable machines, and it's kind of an area of AI to learn and understand human language, essentially. So there's a lot that fits in with, speech and voice recognition and text recognition and that area as well. But essentially, fundamentally, it's like, how does a machine understand what us as humans are trying to say and what we're trying to convey and what we're trying to communicate? I think as well, just quickly as well, I think we'll refer to NLP a few times today as well, maybe for it's a bit easier on the tongue. But the other NLP is neuro-linguistic programming as well, which is not what we're going to be discussing today. So just to touch on that as well before we get going.
Yeah, so there's a few different NLPs, but the one that we're referring to is natural language processing, and that's the last time I'm going to say it like that because it's actually really hard to say. But that's really helpful. And I mean, there's got to be a lot of nuance to what machines actually at what point does a machine's ability to understand what humans are trying to communicate and people are necessary, right? There's, is there nuance that doesn't get captured by NLP and things that it's really good for?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole host of applications for it, right? And I think that's the thing. I think it's trying to understand, when we talk about natural language processing, where the right place is to apply it to what we're trying to achieve, and where it can replace something and where it can maybe augment something. So they're different scales at which we can rely on it. And it also depends on what it is we're trying to get out of it as well, right? Because we might want to be doing something quickly and be absolutely happy to have something that's maybe a little less accurate, but it can get me to something that I'm trying to understand versus something that I need to be super precise on as well. And so there are a lot of nuances to it. And I think when we think about different applications, as I said, that can be at different ends of the scale, add a lot of complexity to how we apply it. And so I guess some examples of that, if you think of Siri, Alexa, probably have sent mine off already, having said that keyword. But when we're kind of communicating to, systems such as those, there's a lot of natural language processing going on within those tools, right? And they're trying to understand what you're saying, but maybe they're understanding to a certain confidence level. And so they can catch some keywords and hopefully a lot of the time understand, but we all know how difficult that can be at times as well. So you can see how certain applications of it, if you're relying on it too much, maybe not the right way to do it. And so I think that's where, when we look at natural language processing, we maybe need to look at some of the areas that it is used, and where it's strongest and where it's maybe falls down. But coming back to how good is it and how good can it be, I think it's something that's come on leaps and bounds, along with a lot of the technology that we work with that has AI and things involved. And if you think about all the the tools out there that we use, and from a Grammarly, as far as a natural language processing tool, to as I said, the likes of which I've mentioned before, but like, our language as humans is constantly evolving, and the way we speak to each other, the language that we use, the words that we use, the slang, colloquial terms, accents, everything around that is constantly evolving. And so there's kind of a catch up as well that I think a lot of times is getting applied to this area of AI, in order to kind of, how close can we get it to really being on top of the way we speak and the way we understand each other. So I've kind of jumped around a few things.
Yeah.
You want to jump? I don't know if we want to dip into certain areas or.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting as you give some of those examples of even just mentioning Siri and Alexa, and you said like it has come leaps and bounds. And if you go way back in time, before Siri and Alexa were a thing, like trying to be on the phone, navigating through like a probably an NLP voice tree to get to a representative, it's like, years ago that was impossible to navigate through. And now we do have things like Alexa and Siri to help us get the information we need within some level of confidence, which is so interesting to see develop. But as you mentioned, that it sort of depends on the nuance, depends on the application and what you're really trying to get out of it. So I'd love to dive into some of those applications. You mentioned a few, but what are some examples of marketers and market research professionals using NLP?
Yes, I think there's a number. So, I mean, everything from, I guess we start off, there's chatbots, which are an area, and maybe from a, marketing side, and as a tool we use for chatbots for lead generation and other things like that. And I think they're a good example of where there's a lot of more rules-based logic that's going on in the background to try and decipher what someone is asking for to a good enough level of confidence to send them down a certain route. You talked about that when you on the phone trying to book your cinema ticket a number of years back, and trying to get the right time for the right show, and those things becoming very difficult. But I said those things have come on a lot, and so understanding, I think when you think about the chatbot side of things, it maybe doesn't need to be as accurate as maybe when we're because we're not seeing the results when we tend to and understanding what's going on exactly in the background. It's just like that confidence level of, okay, I've picked up on these keywords, therefore I'm going to go down this decision route, or understand how to send them to where they need to be. I think some other areas where, from a more of an insight side of things, I mean, sentiment analysis is obviously one that's used a lot in a lot of platforms and a lot of systems, and that's all around trying to understand language and the context of language. And I think years and years ago with natural language processing, the approach to that would be lots of kind of hard and fixed rules, right? And then it's like, how do we start to turn those into doing things more intelligently? And with AI moving forward, how do we provide big data sets to models to start to understand common context, common words that are said, and all these different areas that can help us kind of get to that a lot better. But like, sentiment analysis is a great example of the way people speak, and with sarcasm and lots of other different areas, and even the topics that they're talking about can be hard to really always get completely accurate. And so, if you think about, it's not rained in weeks. It's, that could be something that's like, oh, it's great. We've had an awesome summer. It's, it's been so hot and all of these things. So from one end, that could be a positive sentiment. For someone else who's relying on, maybe a farming industry, agricultural industry, like those things can be very negative in their sentiment, right? So there's like lots of things that, depending on the context around the question, the actual words within it can massively change that sentiment and what they're about. So I think that's where it's, it's trying to be understanding of where we can rely on things for maybe sets of trend data and relying on grouping things together, as opposed to, really getting into the nitty gritty of expectation that every bit of analysis from a machine is going to be spot on. And I guess the other area as well, just to touch on, is probably machine translation, which is another good example of natural language processing, and where if you went through and just translated word for word English into French, and then you translated word for word French back into English, likelihood is what you had originally would have already changed just with that process, right? So the ability to translate things accurately really comes down to understanding, the context, the order of the words, what it means within that, and that kind of breakdown and real understanding, as said, has progressed massively due to the way we've been able to kind of, ingest larger sets of data and start to train models on that data. But again, I think that's where, in the world of kind of insights and research and things like that, there's different levels of application to how you can train data. So in the world of CX, customers are talking about, your competitor brands, your products and things like this. It's easy to maybe train those models up on lots of underlying data, but maybe when something's trying to understand something when you're doing other types of research that is a lot more open-ended and unstructured in the way you're going about it, structuring that data can be a lot more difficult to get accurate in the same way. So again, we can start to understand of where AI in general and machine learning and natural language processing really work well, is where you can get some more predictive sets to those results. But generally, that's the bit that we want to get that unstructured into that structured, right? So it's this balance of like, how do we get there, and where can we rely on it, and how do we know when it's reliable, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you're saying, this is all based on what data the model is built on. So as more data becomes available just in life, in society, and how people communicate with each other, there's just constantly, this is a battle that researchers are having all the time, is like, there's so much data. How do we bring it all together? How do we understand it? But if it's, all that data, if we're relying on that in the right place to kind of feed the NLP models, then actually it could help us to automate the analysis of that stuff if we kind of keep kind of looping it back through. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, definitely. But it's not, I guess the challenge is that's not always possible. So if it's something in innovation and R&D where it's something that's brand new, or like, how do you loop in all of this other data set to know that, this is the context and therefore this is the sentiment towards it? And I think that's, that's where it becomes challenging. But I think it's where, as I said, we need to understand what we're expecting out of these systems, and where we want to play a part as humans within this process and our understanding. There's definitely areas where, I want to look at something and I've got a huge set of data and I just want it to give me trend data, and it's fine. It doesn't need to get every last bit of it for me to understand, a sentiment towards a certain topic or theme within that trend data. But at other times you might want to not miss anything underlying at all within that data. So I don't know, maybe there's like different areas where, it's imperative that we capture everything. And so the problem is, I think people become skeptical of how this didn't categorize this quite how I thought it would, or how I expected it to. And so go from, kind of a difficulty to trust the systems underneath that are bringing this data to life. And I think that's where, from a my perspective from a research perspective and things like that, like you're either happy to take those trends and go with it, but we shouldn't swing all the other way, and we should be able to let a lot of this understanding augment what we get from that data. So again, if I'm going through things manually, there's a lot of times and a lot of chance that there will be things that picked up on that otherwise I would have missed, or and I think trends and data sets is a good example. If you kind of combine 2, 3, 4 bits of individual data along with some open-end text, a system is able to categorize those things together for you and see what those trends are. So you can see what people within certain demographics in certain areas might be talking about a specific topic with a certain sentiment. And they're the bits that become really time consuming for us as individuals if we're trying to do them. And that's where natural language processing and these systems can really help get us there quicker, and maybe also pull up things that we otherwise may not have found or may not have noticed in that data set.
Yeah, and you brought up something interesting about trusting the data, how it's delivered, or what are some of the ways that people can kind of get on board with some of the data that they're being presented or the results that they're seeing from NLP. I know, like, I can think of dashboards, just, marketing attribution data, right? Where if I can see the underlying data that's kind of informing the reports or the dashboards that I'm looking at, then I can validate things and I can, spot check. But when I don't see anything and I just get kind of the high level numbers or dashboards or whatever, I tend to not trust it. And that's sort of an application for marketing, which isn't really related to NLP, but, just more so in how the machine is serving up the results. If I can't, I might not be digging into every data point, but if I can't at least see it and spot check it a little bit, I tend to not rely on it. What are some of the ways that people can get a little bit more trustworthy with the maybe NLP data and insights that they're seeing?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely that element of being able to kind of connect the dots between it a little bit. But I think you can also see it if you start to, there's a lot of systems out there. I think just getting kind of just starting to use those systems and kind of automatically you start to see a lot of value from the data that comes out of it. And as I said, I think if you start at the point where it's like, I'm going to come into this and someone sold me in on this system that's going to completely strip out 100% of any of the human element of work I need to do to get to this data set, like having some kind of realistic expectations depending on what that data set is. If it's, as I said, if it's a smaller defined set of results, then yes, you'll probably be able to have a lot more ability to get to a much higher accuracy. If it's a larger, more broader set of results, then it's like, all right, well, how can I utilize this to augment what what I'm coming to find out about, or the data that I'm trying to understand a little bit more. And I think, seeing the data underneath it is also useful. You can see maybe not necessarily why it's made a decision, but you can just set spot check and things like that can be quite useful. But I think it's more of a coming into these with an expectation of where you want to get to and where you want your time to be saved and what you're relying on that for. I said I have a big belief in not necessarily being able to replace the decisions that we're making in these things, but very much so, like, it could give us a good starting point, or it could give us anomalies within that data that otherwise we may not have spotted. Like, how do we find those bits of data that are really interesting? Because if we just go with the general trend data as well, then from an innovation and customer discovery side of things, like, that doesn't always give us what we need. That doesn't take us to the next level of what we're trying to do as companies, through product innovation, through from a marketing perspective, any of that customer understanding. Like, this is where I think there's a huge advantage that NLP can play within that customer understanding, because it can help us to to get to those other insights that maybe we wouldn't have before. And I think a good example of that is just if you look at how, you can send a Slack message to someone, and you could send that same Slack message and 5 people will interpret it in 5 different ways, right? And they could all have interpreted it correctly, or they could be completely wrong, or whatever that might be. But there's a level of, like, as humans, we sometimes struggle to have that complete understanding, the tone, the inflection points within that. And so, again, for a machine to do things beyond the capabilities of what we're able to do as humans, I think at this stage is not going to happen. But the advantage of that as well is if you look at a bit of data between us, 3 people look at the same data sets or the same information, other things come in there. Those are the perspectives that they have on that information. In the same way, will perhaps open up different routes of areas of innovation, customer discovery, understanding, and all these other things as well. So I think it's like, how do we leverage this as, it's another perspective, it's another teammate as well on those sorts of things in systems that we're using to get us to some of that data and information. Yeah.
I like that outlook on it, that it's kind of another perspective. It's another teammate who's looking at the same data set and maybe has different information than we do as humans. And as you were saying, like talking about expectations for the data, there's been so much conversation and this movement towards more agile testing and more iterative testing. And there's a time and a place for that, like perfectly planned, perfectly executed study, and a time and a place for the thing that's going to save you time, the thing that's going to get you one step closer. You're going to run a study next after that one. It's not the end all be all, but it's the what can you do in 5 minutes as opposed to what can you do in 5 years or whatever, 5 months, maybe more accurately on the insight side of things. But this seems to fit in really well with that movement of, just kind of getting to new ideas more quickly and being able to retest those and validate those and not be so reliant 100% of the time on that perfect research.
Yeah. I 100% agree. I mean, that's an area, I'm from a, more of a product perspective, maybe on this as well, is something that, I'm hugely passionate about in that, that understanding and iterating through ideas. And by iterating through an idea, you uncover a different set of information that provides you the ability to make another decision next. And so again, every time you branch off into a different decision-making process and a different opportunity to make a decision, you discover something new from that. I think when we set ourselves out and plan things too far in the future, or we go through some of these bigger, longer processes to get to information, we kind of blinker ourselves from the ability to see more from information that we can gather within a different context, within a different perspective, within a different use case that we can move quickly on and understand from. And I think that's the bit that, as I said, yeah, this fits in, extremely well with, because it can help you to uncover something new. And I think that's where it's like, this isn't something where, that's coming into, replace what we're doing in any of our roles. It's coming into kind of, it's something that can help you. And as you said, like, what are the bits where you don't want to spend a load of time? And that massively, matters with, what's the right process for you, your team, your company, and things like that as well. And there's a time and a place for going about research in different ways. But, that ability to quickly get into stuff, make a decision and move on, I think gives, a lot of teams scope to make those improvements. And I think that's, that goes on to kind of other conversations that we've had in the past and things as well, with like, how does it better support allowing your team to move forward quicker and make better decisions? And I think where we struggle with some of this is, well, if, I can't let my team go and do something because there's maybe not there's certain areas that teams don't want other ones interfering with, or, moving forward and things like that. And kind of that ability to, for me to give more autonomy and understanding and scale that data out across an organization and give ways of digging into this and finding more information can only be a good thing. But I think at times we kind of perceive these things as not so useful in research, and we try to kind of make sure we get to that perfect answer a lot of times. And there's by building out kind of the teams that we have and allowing those other perspectives of other people from the team to kind of understand this data and maybe help them get there quicker, then maybe it's not every time that you need it, but maybe it helps someone else get there quicker on your team to get them to a decision to move things forward as well. So again, it allows us to scale out that innovation and understanding side of things.
Yeah, for sure. And we've given some good examples of where it works really well, and what you're talking about, and this kind of being able to uncover something new, understanding trends and using it in more of a directional way, or kind of augmenting things that we know. What are some examples of where NLP doesn't work as well, or we don't want to rely on it because we really do need that perfect answer, or some other reason? What are some examples where we don't necessarily want to rely on NLP?
Yeah, I think that's where we want to, as you said, it's those scenarios where we do want to understand and listen to every word that someone said, or, and this tends to be like maybe against, it's like smaller data sets essentially, but then, as where NLP and other things will work, much better is when they've got that broader data set sitting behind them as well. So when you've got smaller data sets, that data set's maybe something that's difficult to train models on, or other things as well. Maybe that's where it is less reliant. But I think, and I think there's also, the general, understanding around how these things get trained and the data that they get trained on. And I think that's something that, just as a, is something that I guess the industry and technology companies are starting to, think about more and more, but maybe in the past haven't. And how we, whatever systems we put in place to understand data and give us things off the back of that data is going to be biased by the data that we've given it to learn from in the first place. And we've seen lots of examples in the past of different AI engines and things, and the bad results that can happen off the back of that. So I think that's also where we want to just be, more as a, less as something maybe as a, sometimes hard to understand as an individual where, where that might happen. But talking as an industry, and as, when the big technology players behind that as well, making sure that we're kind of conscious of where we're getting our data sets from and how we're understanding the data. They're the areas that could, potentially have negative impact on what gets pulled out. And that could, that could bias a lot of decisions and things off the back of it, I guess.
Yeah. And that seems like a bit of a black box sometimes, because most of the time we don't know where especially if you're kind of working with a vendor or something, and you don't know what data has been used to train the models. I mean, I guess, what are some questions that insights professionals or marketers out there should be asking when they are going into, leveraging some sort of AI?
Yeah, I guess it's just maybe an understanding of like where that data is coming from and how it's getting used. As I said, there's like within certain, this is where I think training models on certain data sets can be really useful to get you to that information. But, I think in certain places where you can do that, a lot of times you're maybe providing that data yourselves as well. So, hey, we've got all these open ends from the last 5 years or 3 years of whatever it is, of customer calls or something, or, things that have come in from other surveys. Like maybe we could use that to train up our models and things. And I think there's, in some areas, there's a bit of control that you have over how that data is provided and what it is, and just thinking about where that's coming from. Other times, I think it's where you get into the more specifics of less around the kind of, I guess it's where, when you get into that more kind of, very structured data sets and things that are around, around specific companies and information that you're providing around that. I think there's, as a broader sense, as I said, there's so many systems out there and there's so many technologies out there trying to understand language. And I think that's, a lot of times it's like maybe understanding where that's coming from and how, how that's been put together is a good thing to understand. But a lot of that comes down to what the pure base of some of that natural language understanding, I guess, and processing of that, grabbing that open-end text, breaking that down into each individual word, understanding how those words relate to each other in the context that they have, understanding whether something's a name of a person or a company or a brand, or, tagging parts of those speech, or, all of those things are a lot of times based around fundamentals of linguistics, language, and that's what a lot of the training originally has happened from, that a lot of NLP stems from. And that's kind of the basic process that it's initially going through. If you're using it to then, align that with other sets of data, that's the bit that we can be a bit more, okay, how do I understand where those other sets of data are, maybe? Because I guess the fundamentals of it are more of a, I guess, trying to teach a machine in the same way we'd, learn at school or be taught about language and how those things break down. And yeah, I guess that's a whole different conversation of how we approach that from an educational point of view and how that feeds into the technology as well. But yeah, I think if it's being used in more of a what is the language and how is that how are we pulling out sets of key themes and topics and things like that, like that's where things like sentiment on top of that can start to complicate it. And then if you layer on machine learning data that then says, okay, well, we've seen this word being used and therefore we're training it on this data set, how that word gets used in maybe different countries or different areas could potentially impact the decision that it makes off the back of it, right? Because that context isn't there with some of that data. So yeah, I think it's more just understanding some of the basics of the analysis and to what level it's the systems we're using are trying to make decisions versus, as I said, augmenting our understanding, rather than being like, here's the end result and here's what it is. Like that's where we could get into more trouble, I guess, when we give the answer to everything based on a machine's decision.
Sure. Yeah. We still need to layer on that kind of human expertise and validation on top of what we've learned from the machine, which is really like a head start almost. And what should teams be considering before using NLP?
I guess, interesting question. I guess from what perspective are you thinking? I guess like I'm completely new to this, or I'm like.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm kind of if I'm a marketer, I'm a market researcher, and I've been coding all of my own open ends, and I've been watching all my own kind of focus group videos and manually coding things. Like, what should I consider before making the leap to relying a little bit more on machine analysis?
Yeah, no, perfect. Thanks. I think that comes down to like why and where are we choosing to use technology to support our roles? And so what's the end goal, what's the outcome that you're looking for as a team or an individual to help you? And that might be around, I just want something that's searchable. And so, if you've got something where you can have something in, you've taken your focus group, you've got a full transcription of that focus group, and now you want to be able to search that and let other teammates search it and things like that. Like that's one area that you could be looking at that's going to be the time saver for you, right? There's lots of different areas where I think I think we use I think NLP is like something that we're so used to using in so many systems. I think it's just at times maybe not overthinking it as well. I mean, it's from how we use search capabilities to how we use chatbots, other things. Like we're all interacting with a lot of this technology day to day anyway. So it's more just like, what are the systems and things out there that you really feel could help you? Is it around that Is it something that, okay, right, I'm taking my notes and I'm having to get to this data and that's the struggle. Okay, what are the things out there that could really help you improve that process? If it's down to, I've got huge, large data sets and I want to understand common topics or themes and things like that. If it's, I think it's really breaking down, like, where are you seeing areas that could be improved within your team, your process, and other things as well. And I think just taking that leap into some of those technologies, not expecting it to necessarily be like, as I said, like going in and expecting, machine transcription and translation of, everything that you have to be 100% accurate all the time isn't going to be, realistic, I guess, in a lot of cases. And then I think there's a lot of systems out there that really talk about super high accuracy, but there's, like, as I said, there's nuance to all of this. There's difficulties that we have understanding each other when we speak and communicate. So I think expecting, the machine level to be beyond some of those capabilities. I think we just need to, as I said, it's a realistic expectation setting. But like, if I don't need that 100% accuracy and 95% accuracy is going to get me there and it's good enough for what I need to do, then it's going to save me a bunch of hours. Great, right? There's some area that can help you within where you're using it. But, so it might be, chatbot scenarios, helping out with those sorts of understanding service desk data, whatever that might be. I think it's like, where are we spending time essentially doing repetitive tasks, and where could we, use technology to help us with those repetitive tasks?
Yeah. And I mean, what you said, just like, don't overthink it. There's probably all the places that we're avoiding any kind of machine intervention in our lives. We're probably using it 100 other places that we are not even thinking about. As you were talking about, like Siri earlier on in the conversation or whatever, it's like, any voice commands in your car, even just a Google search, like, any paid kind of Google Ads campaign is going to have some broad match in there that's interpreting what you're typing into the search bar and delivering you some, it's not a direct keyword search. It's really taking into account context and things like that. And we're using that all the time, without realizing it and probably not questioning it, but in areas where maybe we're a bit more aware, which is not a bad thing, but would probably tend to overthink what am I getting? What's the result? Is it reliable? It's important to be considering those things, but to not overthink it and be curious and see what we can learn could be an interesting place to get started.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, it's ever evolving as well, right? I think there's benchmarks from 6 months ago will not be the benchmarks that we have now. It's a technology that's moving on so quickly. And I think it's also the fact that there's so much out there, and I think that's probably the most difficult thing for most people when they're maybe getting started is which technology, which SaaS platform, which provider is going to give me what I need for my application. And that's where it becomes maybe a little bit more difficult because you don't understand necessarily the strengths and weaknesses of those. So sometimes it is just getting stuck in and understanding and evaluating. And I think that's the problem sometimes is maybe making that commitment to doing that, because it's always that getting over that hurdle of I've got to put in this work to understand these things that I need to, to help me further down the line. But when it's something, as I said, not being too scared about it, but just what you're trying to do within your research and everything else, what you're trying to achieve. Therefore, there's probably a bunch of different systems that will do them in different ways out there for you. I mean, just kind of, getting in there and understanding. It's, I think that's a good thing for us all to do. And you'll find some things work better than others, but that's typical of any technology that we use, right? And it's the ability to kind of start at a place where you're like, what am I trying to do, or what pain points can these systems solve for me, and which ones can do that in the best way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been really helpful because Like I said, I know very little about this like AI NLP stuff. So thanks for coming on and explaining all of that to us.
No, good. It's been it's been fun to chat through. As I said, it's one of those that there's not unfortunately here's the scenario where you should use this answer.
Right.
But I think it's it's been good to kind of talk through the different applications and where it might be useful. But enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's, this is one of those topics that doesn't get a lot of airtime, and we just assume that we all know what's happening under the hood there. So thanks for lifting it for us. Thanks everybody for listening in today. On another episode soon, we're talking with Jason Alliger of Traeger. We'll see you then.